Hello. I'd like to begin this afternoon by respectfully acknowledging that UBC Okanagan is situated on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today, many of you from places afar, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. My name is Jen Jacoby, and I have the pleasure of being the director for the Institute of Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention. And I welcome you to the 12th annual Okanagan Embrace Aging Month. And I thank you for joining us today. I'm very excited about our two guests today. Before we let them lead us off into their information, I would like to give you a little bit of information about Embrace Aging and our hosts. First off, Embrace Aging is co-hosted by Beam Credit Union, Interior Health, and the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention here at UBC Okanagan. It's hard to believe, but Embrace Aging was launched 12 years ago to celebrate and raise awareness for positive aging. And we've once again this year organized a number of educational opportunities and events, all during the month of March. The sessions are designed for everyone, young and old alike, and a focus on a variety of topics is undertaken related to healthy aging, ways to improve quality of life for older adults, their family, and caregivers. Our goal truly is to inspire everyone to embrace positive aging. Now, before I introduce today's guests, a few little aspects of Zoom. Closed captioning. To turn closed captioning off, select the Hide Caption button on the menu bar. Miraculously, it disappears. Now, questions. Please type your general questions or comments for the speakers into the chat box during the presentation. Questions will be read at the end of the presentation and addressed at that time. Now, if you have specific questions that are a little bit more private on female, reproductive, and hormonal health, please, in the chat box will be the SEMCOR email link. You can address your questions to Dr. Pryor there if they're of more of a personal nature. At the end, feedback for this event. Please complete the survey. It really does help us inform our future activities and events, just like this one today was asked by the public. So we're very excited to finally introduce to you today's speakers. So today's session is navigating perimenopause and menopause through established facts and emerging discoveries. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jerilynn Pryor, Professor of Endocrinology at UBC Vancouver and founder and scientific director for the Center for Menstrual Cycle and Ovulation Research. Joining us today as well from very far is Dr. Ferraz, Professor of Clinical Reproductive Medicine at the University of Munich, who I believe today is joining us from Brazil. In addition to being a professor in Munich, she's also a researcher at the Toronto Zoo. Welcome, and I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Pryor.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be with you today. So we're going to talk about perimenopause, which is one of those confusing parts of women's midlife, and define it and show you how to live healthily through it. Because there are real challenges from perimenopause to healthy living, but there are appropriate solutions for chronic disease prevention. I acknowledge that I'm deeply grateful to the Coast Salish peoples on whose lands I live and work, and who have been stewards of these lands for generation on generation. I have no commercial interests, and I confess to thinking that progesterone is beautiful. So I want to impress upon you that although people think as soon as they get a hot flush or a night sweat that they're getting aged, like this ancient Gary oak in Victoria, but really it's the springtime of a new phase of life. It is opportunity as well as challenge. So today we're going to talk about the definitions, because one of the biggest detriments to getting help that you need and communicating with your physician is that there's mixing up of perimenopause and menopause. We'll talk about what the hormonal and experience changes are of perimenopause and how they differ from those of menopause and how they're similar. And we'll talk about how to deal with this hormonal chaos that really is perimenopause, and then show you that progesterone can promote healthy aging. So I think of perimenopause as the ovaries grand finale, with a fireworks show. There's, beautiful Roman candles, and then this one and that one. And the very end of the show, it's, one after another. That's what's happening in the ovary during perimenopause. So what do I mean by perimenopause? Well, first of all, perimenopause is as different from menopause as chalk from cheese. And the first thing we have to define is menopause. It turns out if I were to ask 3 different people, they would say 3 different things. So the average woman will say, oh, menopause is all that's changing and not very nice about getting old. If I ask a gynecology colleague, they will say menopause is the final menstrual period. But ask an epidemiologist or many other scientists, and they will say, as the World Health Organization does, menopause is women's final life phase that begins a year after the last menstruation. It's a transition. That year without any flow is necessary to know it's final. Okay? So the official meaning of menopause is the final life phase for someone born with ovaries that begins a year after the last period. So don't let anyone else tell you that you're menopausal until you've been a year. And until that time, you're in perimenopause. So perimenopause and menopause, part of the confusion is that they share relative or absolute infertility. They share hot flushes and night sweats called vasomotor symptoms, and they share sleep problems. But perimenopause and menopause do not share things like mood swings, depression, anxiety, breast tenderness, mental fog, trouble concentrating, heavy flow. Those are not typical of menopause. They're typical of perimenopause. So what about perimenopause? Well, here again, there's some language things. In the United States, the official language is the menopause transition, and it's both early and late. But we've known for a long time that perimenopause doesn't begin or end until a year after the last period, which is late perimenopause. And there's a controversial phase I want you to know about, because it's the time you may be the most symptomatic and have the hardest time getting care. That means when you still have regular periods, but you have night sweats or hot flushes or new sleep problems or new migraines or worse migraines or things that are typical of perimenopause. But there's a pathway here. So once you start getting irregular periods, now I'm in early menopause transition. Or when you have a skipped period, now I'm in late menopause transition. And you have a period and then you don't get any more for a year. Yay, I graduated. So the age at which perimenopause can begin is not very clear because it sort of sneaks up on us. But about 35 is around the earliest naturally, and that doesn't mean you're going to have too early a menopause. We know from other studies that the age on average in the Western world at which you skip your first period is about 48 years. And in, again, North America, the average age at menopause is about 52. Okay? All right, so now we know the definitions. Now let's talk about what really happens. Well, what does a pregnant woman have to do with perimenopause? Isn't that a weird thing? What is typical is that a perimenopausal woman may dream she is pregnant. That's what Janine O'Leary-Cobb, a sociologist, wrote in her introduction to her book. The woman of the Kalahari Desert, a woman who was interviewed by an anthropologist, reported the same thing. I had the same experience. So what is our subconscious dream mind telling us? And that's really an important question. Okay, so the general thought is that estrogen levels are high in young women, and then they start dropping, and that's the story of perimenopause and menopause. Well, let's find out if that's true. And I like to use random population-based samples. And so this is a study of Melbourne where voting records were used to decide who would be offered a chance to be in a study. These were women 45 to 55 years old. They had to have an intact uterus, not take hormones, or be on the birth control pill. They also had to have had a period within the last 3 months. So they enrolled, this is some years ago now, 438 women with a participation rate of 56%, which is reasonable. The mean age at when they joined the study was 49. Their body mass index was just above the healthy limit, and they were overall a very healthy cohort. They'd had their pap tests, they had their screening mammograms, etc. Few were smokers also. And what the group, Henry Berger and Lorraine Dennerstein and colleagues wanted to do was to get some idea of hormone levels. So they decided to measure serum estrogen early in the cycle once a year in this prospective study. They measured it on cycle days 3 through 8, so that's sort of mid-flow, and then a day or so beyond most flow. And it was fasting in the morning, and they analyzed the data by what's called geometric mean. Now, again, this was early days, and they didn't know quite how to characterize these women with different types of cycles, different experiences. So they called women with regular cycles premenopausal, which we now doubt is true. They called women with changes in flow, which could be either more flow or less flow. Group 3 was changes in cycle length, which could be shorter or longer. Group 4 was changes in both cycle length and flow. And the last group, group 5, were those who had been 3 to not quite 12 months without a period. So they weren't yet menopausal. And what we have here is a dot for each person. Okay, don't worry about numbers, but just look overall. And I think you can see there's a huge spread of dots, right? And if I drew onto the diagram that was published, this line here at the bottom, which is the average from a Melbourne population for premenopausal women early in their cycle, same cycle days. So all of these dots should be in this yellow zone down here, but they're not. The second line is the average for the mid-cycle estrogen peak that happens in a normal menstrual cycle, again, from premenopausal women. So look at how many dots are above that mid-cycle peak, which is the highest that estrogen ever goes in the normal premenopausal menstrual cycle. So I looked at this diagram in 1995. I was in perimenopause. I was convinced my own estrogen levels were high. And I said, yes, this, this spoke to me and said I was right. And then I finished reading the paper, and the paper said estrogen levels drop across the menopausal transition. Why? And I was actually mad because the average here is higher, the geometric mean, I should say, is higher here than here. And they didn't even see how dramatically wildly swinging these data were. Here's another example of that swinging estrogen. Here's a mid-cycle estrogen peak. It makes a second peak and it comes down to the next period, which is this little black thing here. Here's progesterone. It doesn't rise until after the mid-cycle peak, goes up high, and then comes back down nicely. But look what happens in perimenopause. First of all, there's a really long follicular phase here. Estrogen makes about the same peak. It drops down like it should. Progesterone is rising, but then estrogen goes crazy. And in the midst of this craziness, another flow happens, and often that's a heavy flow. Now, this is just barely an ovulatory cycle that's too short in luteal phase length. So you get an idea, which I'm trying to get across, that perimenopause is about hormonal chaos because it's a transition. And my thought is this: we have a fail-safe in our system. We have many, many more follicles, each of which can produce an egg and produce estrogen than we need for a normal fertile life cycle. So then we come to perimenopause. We don't need any more follicles. We don't need any more babies. We have to get rid of them because we don't want a period when we're 90. And this is the way we do it, is by having more follicles, each of which makes estrogen. And the result is the chaos of perimenopause. Now, what I showed you before told us something about estrogen. Now I want to show you something about progesterone. So what you have in the top part of this diagram are cycles in turquoise and luteal phase or progesterone ovulation to the next flow length in yellow. And a normal, or the lowest, shortest a luteal phase length can be, and be normal, is 10 days by our method. Okay, so you can see that this person is regularly cycling and regularly ovulating, except one cycle in which she ovulated with a short luteal phase. Now, it just happened, and I could tell you the story about it, but it happened that she kept taking her cycles and wrote to me and said, I'm having heavy flow and I'm having night sweats. What should I do? 10 years later. And I learned that she had kept her records. So we plotted the same time, start the same months, plotted another 14 months of her current cycles 10 years later. And I think you can see that she's still cycling regularly. But look what's happened to her ovulation. Not a single luteal phase is normal, and 2 of the cycles don't ovulate at all. So estrogen is up and progesterone is down in perimenopause. But one of the main reasons that perimenopause is so difficult is because stress hormone levels also increase. And this is a central brain response to dropping estrogen levels. That the brain just goes crazy and makes all the neurotransmitters and hormones it knows how to make. So there's increased central brain production of norepinephrine and increased adrenal production of cortisol, the stress hormone we all know about. And it's interesting because those same downswings in estrogen produce night sweats and hot flushes. But if someone in perimenopause says, I'm not myself, I don't know who I am anymore, or I'm always feeling anxious. We understand why. It's built in to perimenopause, which has increases in norepinephrine, ACTH, and cortisol. Now, before you think, as many do, that every woman becomes a basket case in perimenopause, to the best of our knowledge, only 15 to 30 of every 100 women become highly symptomatic. And there are a few who never, ever have a night sweat or hot flush. There are very few who don't have some disturbance of sleep. But about a third of women, which is why the 30%, have heavy flow. And that doesn't compute with most people's thoughts about perimenopause as estrogen deficiency. So we usually blame it on fibroids, and that's not accurate. Okay, so how do the high estrogen, lower progesterone, higher stress hormones relate to women's symptoms? Remember the study I just told you about? This is information from the same women 5 years later. They were asked by questionnaire about a number of typical things. How's your energy? Are you feeling cheerful or are you feeling blue? Etc. And what I've done in this table is to translate the language that we now use about perimenopause and only record those symptoms more than 30% of women experience. Okay, so you can see that lower energy is pretty common across the board. And depression increases in that late menopause transition after a skip period. Headaches tend to get a little better, maybe. Aches and pains are common throughout. Sleep trouble, common throughout, maybe getting a little worse. Anxiety things getting worse in the late transition again. Hot flushes also worse then, night sweats worse then. But the opposite with breast tenderness, which is worse in very early perimenopause and then gets better. So now that we have a hormonal picture and an idea of the experiences of perimenopause, how are we going to go about dealing with it? That's weird. Okay, so when I was in practice, and that's been a while ago now, I would give my patients a kind of a set of things that they should keep in mind. The first thing is that perimenopause is not old. You're decades from being old, and that they will survive perimenopause. In other words, this misery will pass. And that's an important thing, because if you think perimenopause and menopause are the same, you think you're going to live like this for the rest of your life, and that's horrifying. Because the high estrogen of perimenopause is because normal feedback loops are broken on purpose. Giving more estrogen doesn't make sense, so avoid estrogen therapy until you're menopausal. Now, this next one, take care of yourself, is a little hard for most people to fathom, but it really means, stop focusing for a minute on your work, on your kids, on your partner, and think about what you yourself need to feel well. Take me time. Learn to say no to those endless requests. Now, this sounds like motherhood and apple pie, but it really, really is important to continue to do at least walking exercise 30 minutes a day. This is essential. Another, to deal with those high stress hormones, is learn the skills that are necessary to practice mindfulness, meditation, yoga breathing, or something that allows you to take the stress level down. Now, complex things happen to bone in midlife. In fact, it's the major time of bone loss, more bone loss before you get to be menopausal than right afterwards. And on the SEMCOR website, is this article, which you should look up. The important thing is much of what I've said above, but also ensuring you get enough calcium and vitamin D, as well as managing your weight. And it's hard not to gain weight, but not gaining too much, and certainly don't lose weight. And then I'll show you the evidence, cyclic or daily progesterone, if you're miserable with hot flushes and night sweats. Okay, now the current guidelines for menopause now, which often means both perimenopause and actual menopause, say that women should be taking menopausal hormone therapy, which means estrogen with some progestin. The evidence for that is lacking. We do not have randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials showing that menopausal hormone therapy works in perimenopause. I don't understand how these organizations can get away with recommending something that's never been tested. But that is the current state right now. And I was extremely clear myself that my estrogen levels were high and I did not want to take more estrogen, but I did need some help to deal with night sweats and sleep problems. So we had already shown that menopausal women could be, their hot flushes and night sweats could be effectively treated by progesterone, the natural hormone therapy, which we got in the late 1990s in Canada, or mid-1990s in Canada. So it's oral micronized progesterone. And we applied at SEMCOR at 2011 and were funded by CHR, the Canadian federal granting agency, to do a randomized control trial to see if progesterone would help for perimenopausal night sweats and hot flushes. So we ended up enrolling 180 women, ages 35 to 57, from Nunavut to Nanaimo, across from coast to coast to coast. Their mean age was 50, their body mass index slightly higher than optimal. A major portion of them were university graduates, and most participated remotely. 2/3 of them were in what's called late menopause transition, had already skipped a cycle. And our primary outcome, the thing that we were trying to prove, was that VMS score, which is hot flush, night sweats, number times intensity, was greater on the placebo than the progesterone. In other words, it decreased on the progesterone. However, that was not significant. This was the very first trial that ever looked at studying something for hot flushes only in perimenopause. So we had no idea how many women we needed. And 100 women is plenty to study hot flushes in menopause. Remember the variability of estrogen? I'll show you variability of hot flushes in just a second. But we did include secondary outcomes, what women felt changed in hot flushes, night sweats, flow, sleep quality. In other words, they said, I remember how I was then, and this is how I think I've changed. And some were on placebo and some were on progesterone, and they didn't know the difference, and we didn't. We also asked them about perimenopausal interference with their daily life, and they scored it on a line from 1 to 10. And we could see whether those on progesterone differed from those on placebo. And we measured PHQ-9 to look at depression. So here's the variability in a run-in month when they were on nothing of those who were assigned later to progesterone, those who were assigned later to placebo. So you can see how variable from only a few hot flushes to extremely many. I mean, 60 here. Well, this is daytime and intensity. At any rate, over time, those on progesterone did have a decrease in their night sweats and hot flushes, but it wasn't statistically significant here. You can see how variable when the standard deviation is almost as high as the mean. So when we ask them, what change did you see in daytime overall hot flushes, intensity and number? It wasn't quite statistically significant. Those on progesterone had fewer, but again, not significant. But the change in night sweats was statistically significant, which is important. Also, the change in the intensity women perceived of daytime hot flushes was also decreased on progesterone. What's interesting is that women didn't really perceive a difference in flow, which is telling you that this broken feedback loops in order to get rid of those extra follicles is working, because progesterone in a full dose doesn't do much to flow. But change in sleep quality was remarkably improved on progesterone, and that's a side effect, if you will, of oral micronized progesterone. It's a lovely adverse effect. Now, we also showed that the perception of the interference of perimenopause with daily life was significantly improved on progesterone, and that progesterone did not increase depression. So if I can summarize, perimenopause is a time of major change before menopause starts after 1 year without flow. Estrogen is erratic and increased, progesterone is decreased, stress hormones are increased, so there's heavy flow, unpredictable cycles, night sweats, sleep problems, increased premenstrual symptoms. It's important to understand that perimenopause ends. The transition ends and we reach a point where we don't have follicles anymore that are at risk of being mature and making estrogen. And we can enter into menopause expecting no further chaos in our lives. But in order to weather these changes, we have to be paying attention. We can't carry on ignoring our bodies. We can't carry on ignoring our relationships with other people in which we're the caregivers always. We have to start caring for ourselves. Now, in addition to showing that progesterone improves night sweats and sleep, this study also showed that it improved the overall interference of perimenopause with life. But it turns out, and I don't have the time to show you all the details, that if night sweats and hot flushes are untreated, if women's progesterone levels decrease long before perimenopause, then there's bone loss, but progesterone can increase bone formation, and also that perimenopause can increase heart attacks, but progesterone appears to decrease them. A big study out of the Netherlands decades ago showed that those women who had anovulatory cycles by a progesterone level in the urine were more likely to have heart attacks, even if their estrogen and testosterone levels were normal. So in other words, progesterone can promote healthy aging as well as allow you to survive perimenopause. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerilynn. We're going to turn this over now to Marcia.
Hello and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And coming back at Dr. Prior, it's an honor because she's one of the biggest experts on hormonal and everything, menopause and perimenopause. My talk will be a little bit different. I will focus more on the new research and how we can understand what is going in the ovary. That is where all these hormones, the estrogen, progesterone, are being produced, and what is happening there. That is like we are aging, and then we are not producing hormones anymore. And then like the new tools we have to understand it. But before getting there, me as a veterinarian, and I like to study different animals. And for me, what is really interesting is that most mammals will ovulate until death, so they don't go through menopause. So just humans, some primates, and a few cetaceans like the orcas, they do experience through menopause, which is really interesting for me that and give us a lot of different models to know why some animals do it and someone does not. So one of the hypotheses why humans and these other species go through menopause is the grandmother hypothesis. That means that they think that there is no reason why the grandmother should spend energy in reproduction if you live in a family and she could be using this energy to help care for for her daughter and for her like grandchild. So because of that, things like evolutionary, like the genetics, is still going to be going through the population. So there was no reason why that happens. And these species that were described in menopause, they have a similar social life as we do. They live in families, and then therefore they think this hypothesis is something in there. So I really like seeing those differences and try to understand what is happening and how we can use that information to actually understand better what happens in humans. But that is just a curiosity that I wanted to bring to you today. And the other next, I want to talk about like menopause. It's something that we think we don't talk about it, right? But why don't we talk about it if it does affect so many people? Just in Canada, we have more than 10 million women within the menopause age range, that is 45 to 55 years old, and that is a quarter of the population. So why do we have so many people that like is suffering from that perimenopause and menopause, but we don't talk about it, we don't research about it, we have such little understanding of it. And then like all the this aging has so many health consequences, not just the health and the flushes and everything, like Dr. Prior said. You can have bone problems, you can have cardiac problems, we can have metabolic and weight change, sexual dysfunction, musculoskeletal issues, also mental health. So I don't understand why we don't talk more about it, right? Just an example here in BC, Professor Bruto with colleagues have done a study to see the effects of this aging in women in BC. So they have sent a questionnaire for over and have participated over 2,000 people. And as a response, they have seen that like 92% of the people that respond to those questionnaires experience menopause symptoms, which is a lot. 52% report having mental health conditions. And not just like having those changes happening, what they seen that was really interesting is that like for 30% of the women in there, it affected their working and their productivity. So 17% of them had reduced working hours, almost 10% of they quit their job, retired earlier, or changed jobs because of menopause and how they would deal with those hot flushes or the mental fog and all those symptoms during work. 5% of them turned down promotions because they could not deal with that. And even like, doesn't seem like much, but 1% of they lost their jobs because of menopausal symptoms. So that is something really huge to think about. And then even though that happens and we have a huge consequence, not just for us as females and woman health, but also for the society, because if you have 30% of these women not working properly, like the loss for the society is also big. So there was a study in the US that they saw the loss is almost $1 billion per year because of women suffering from menopause, both in work related loss and also in costs of healthcare. So even though we have that and a huge amount of the population going through it, we do have a lot of gap in female research to understand female health. So if we think the first randomized double-blind controlled trial was in 1940, and then in 97, from there, like most of the trials were done in men, especially after 1977, when the Food and Drug Administration from the US recommended excluding women of childbearing potential because of risk of drugs having toxicity for the fetus. But then they also broadened that exclusion to women using contraception, single women, or those whose partners were vasectomized because they would have the potential to get pregnant, and they didn't want those women being in drug trials. And then it was only like a couple decades later that they saw the importance of including women in clinical trials. So the National Institute of Health in the US in 1993 revisited that recommendation to also include women in clinical trials. And then here in Canada was a few years later that the guidance they were asking for including women in clinical trials. And then the CIHR, as Dr. Prior has said, that is the granting agency that funds a lot of research, has recommended a few decades later to introduce mandatory in all the research being conducted to use the sex or justify why not male and female. And that had this problem, these decades. So it was 50 years of neglecting women's health research. So there are drugs that works fine for men, but not for women, or have some undesired effects in women and not in men. And we don't know that. We're just learning those things now because in the past we were really neglected in those research, and not just in the research, but also in research funding. There is a really huge stark disparity in research dedicated to women's health, especially understanding and improving therapeutics for reproductive specific needs. And then, for example, in Canada, approximately 30% of women experience reproductive health challenges, not just menopause. I talk here about polycystic ovarian syndrome, endometriosis, and some type of cancer that are just from female. But if we think about the grants, so all the money that has put into research into female reproductive health work between 2009 and 2020 from the CIHR, only 6% of them, actually a little bit less than 6%, was money for studying these female-related diseases, female-related problems, health problems. So it has left us with a huge gap of understanding of what is happening. Why do we have those female problems, including menopause? So for menopause, so what is known about the female aging that is in this perimenopause and menopause periods? So what is known is that the ovary is the only system in our body that is the first one to age. If you see here, we have here fertility is mainly the ovary function around start declining a lot around when you are in your 30s, and then you're 50, the activity is really low. And then, but if you compare to cardiac or to respiratory symptoms or renal flow, those systems doesn't go down. So the ovaries are really interesting to understand how we age and what is happening. So what do we know about ovarian aging? We know that we are born with a set number of follicles, millions of primordial follicles. So those follicles are the egg inside, and also the supporting cells where they are growing to grow and support those eggs to grow, and also produce the hormones like the estradiol. And then after ovulation, we start producing the progesterone. And we know that those follicles, they start declining when around your 30s, and then they're really low when you get to the menopause age. So here you can see on the right pictures, you can see a image, histology image of ovary of a 20-something-year-old female. You can see all these different follicles here with the black arrows. When you get to your 40s, you can see those follicles are much smaller, but not just those follicles. We also see a change in the look of the tissue. And then the eggs that are being released after the decline, they also have a low quality. So we are born with those million of follicles and we have hundreds of repetitive cycles of damage. So ovulation is really damaging. So imagine this follicle is getting big, 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 and then it will rupture, will release the oocyte, and then it will transform itself in a corpus luteum, that is the entity that will produce progesterone. And then that corpus luteum, if you're not pregnant, will like reduce and become a little scar in your ovary. So we have that happening monthly during our age, and that is like as if you were cutting your skin and scarring every time that happens. So it's a lot of cycles of damage, healing, and repair because of ovulation, and this corpus luteum as well after ovulation. And then, so we see that it's associated with a chronic and progressive pro-inflammatory state because all this scarring process that happen is come together inflammation. And they are associated with fibrosis of this excess of deposition of extracellular matrix, that is the matrix that gives supports for the cells to function in the tissues. And then what we also see that this inflammation and fibrosis can lead to this damage and the homeostasis of the tissue, and it's when it stops functioning as it should. And then is when we stop producing hormones and having all the troubles associated with it. So that's what we know now happens during aging. And then, so how can we uncover this physiological cellular and molecular mechanisms that shape this ovarian function and aging? So to get this here, we need ovaries. So how can would a healthy woman donate us her ovaries? So it's really hard. So how we can choose to study and understand what is happening there is with donors, which is really rare. So young ovarian donors, either when people die and then they donate their body for research, or when, for example, kids are going through chemotherapy and then they can preserve their ovaries for maybe in the future having kids, or even for older women doing the same. So it's really hard to get that. So we have relied a lot in animal models. So, but as I told you, not every animal goes through menopause. So how can you rely on an animal model to study ovarian function? So we can modify those animals. And for me as a veterinarian, I also don't like using animal models because we have now better technologies. We learned a lot, but we also need to think about the 3 R's of animal research, so animal welfare. So we need to reduce the number of animals used. We need to refine the test to cause less stress to the animals because they're also live being have that can needs to be treated humanity, and we need to replace. And luckily, we are in a stage that we can have so many different ways of replacing animal studies, at least in the early stages, with in vitro methods that can help us to better understand what is happening. And then, so those in vitro methods for the ovary, we have a lot of different ways. We have ovary on a chip that we call, so these are small devices where we can perfuse culture media and culture little piece of tissues or the follicles or cells in there and mimic how that happens in the body. We have the organoids that are we get stem cells. So they're really new technology, and we can make the stem cells behave as they were ovarian cells. And then I will later talk a little bit about that. We can form spheroids, so we can get the ovarian tissue, we can isolate the cells from that, and then aggregate and form spheroids. Or we have also some more fancy new technologies such as bioprinting. So from the most simple, that is the spheroid, for example, in our lab, I have 2 students working on that. So we get ovarian tissues, we remove the cells from that tissue by a little different digestion with enzymes. We form spheroids and we place the spheroids in a gel to provide then that extracellular matrix that will do support for them to grow. And then we see how they behave in there. So here's just an example of they're outside the gel here at day 1 in A. Day 7, they're the first day in the gel, and then day 14 of day in the gel. What is really interesting, so in this figure here in B in the middle, you can see the little spheroids in there, and just really long, prolonged stuff. They are blood vessel cells. So what is really nice of this model is that they develop this microvasculature. So in the future, if you want to transfer these spheroids to humans or to animals to test maybe hormonal replacement therapies instead of giving people synthetic hormones or animal produced hormones, they could produce hormones from themselves, from our own cells. vasculature is really important to keep the tissue alive. So that's really nice to see. And then when here, just to show you, I'm not going to go in details because of sake of time, but like these spheroids, they have all the different cell types that the ovary has. There are muscle cells, the germ cells, are the cells that compose the egg. Part of the egg and the follicle, cells produce that produce hormone, cells that give like support, like these green ones here in vimentin, and cells that will provide this microvasculature. So that is the most simple way that we could do that. But what is interesting is that we know that we have during aging this fibrosis, right? So the tissue is stiffer because it's like a scar. When you touch it, it's really like harder than the rest of the tissues. So we could change the properties of these hydrogels, is what we are doing in the lab now, changing the properties of these hydrogels and seeing how that influences molecularly those spheroids on the hormonal production and behavior of the cells in that. So we can really understand molecularly what is happening in the ovary during aging. So the other that is a big news, like, is the use of microfluidics. So you have little chambers where you culture your tissues. Here was a work from Northwestern University in the US. Here in blue is mimicking the culture media that would be kind of our blood. So we have reservoirs with this culture media in there. And then we have little places where you can culture different kind of tissues. They are connected. And what it has, the system is here, you can see some connectors coming in. It had like micro pumps that will work like it was your heart. So they will, by a specific flow rate to tell it, will pump this culture media into these cells that are being cultured, and then will mimic the flow of the blood to the tissue and keep that tissue alive. Using these methods in mice, not in humans yet, they were able to culture ovarian follicles in there and then ovulate. So here is just an example of a follicle. And then here you can see an egg out of this follicle that was ovulated, and it was a really viable egg that they even got puppies out of it in mice. I'm really merging new technology is the 3D printing. So you can print those hydrogels that I told you that will give support for growing. So there is also this group from the same University of the Microfluidics that they printed this scaffold where they placed these ovarian follicles in there. So they're similar structure of the tissue. And those follicles were able to ovulate. And then they were able to use the egg from that to also make live pup. Again, in mice, everything is really new and being studied in humans. But as I said, getting humans over to study this is really hard. And the last technology I want to talk to you is the ovarian organoids. That is like something really, really exciting because you can take, for example, a skin biopsy from a patient, get those cells, transform them, and induce them to be pluripotent, like stem cells, and then get those cells to behave like ovarian cells. And then you could, from your skin, get you a mini ovary that you could place back into the patients and do this hormonal replacement, or we could study different ovarian cancers, ovarian disease, or test drugs, and things like that. So, so those are the new technologies. So I like to say the animal models, innovative biotechnologies allow us to gain a really deep understanding of ovarian aging and will help us identify methods to mitigate the effects, like what is happening there, and develop new therapies. For example, there are some studies using like different drugs, such as rapamycin, that is a commonly used cancer drug, to reverse this aging. So they know these drugs can reverse the fibrosis that is happening, or also some metformin, for example, that is a drug used for diabetes. We know they can reverse the fibrosis and actually restore ovarian function in mice. So there are some groups that are studying that and starting soon clinical trials in humans to see if we could delay menopause or help mitigate those hormonal changes, or maybe gradually decrease those in a way that we will suffer less. So what I want you to know that it's a really exciting time for female reproductive health research. I think in the next years, you'll see great progress towards understanding and mitigating peri and postmenopause and female health in general, not just menopause, but a lot of female cancers, such as ovarian cancer, that is the most deadly cancer in women. And just to tell you, like Jerilynn has said, you need to empower yourself. You need to engage in open conversation about menopause with your mother, with your family, with your daughter, with the society, we need to be really careful with misinformation. And I think you are your biggest advocate, so you should partner with good doctors and educate yourself. You come to a doctor that will say, look, I think I'm in perimenopause, I'm having this flash, and they don't talk about it. Don't feel afraid. Go to a new doctor and like empower yourself and get in your community people that will help you navigate this situation. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Marcia and Jerilynn. This has been amazing. It definitely was a great connection to see where we've been, the human body, and all the way through animals and to new technology coming forward. It's an amazing walk through female health. We have a few moments for questions. Jerilynn, I believe this one was directed towards you, but Marcia, feel free to jump in from your perspective as well. Jenna asks, should we take progesterone to prevent bone loss and protect our hearts, even without significant night sweats and sleep problems?
That's a very good question. I think likely not. And what I would like to see is that women are happier and well supported when they're premenopausal, because that is the time when we build and maintain the bone density that we need in order to have a healthy aging. The same is true of the cardiovascular system. In other words, this system works well if we release an egg and progesterone each cycle, but we don't. Often there's very disturbed ovulation. And when we don't have normal ovulation, even if we have enough estrogen, we still lose bone. So the idea that I think matters is to start thinking about the well-being of our daughters and our granddaughters and work with them to develop and maintain healthy, normal ovulatory cycles. So I think we talked about reproductive aging of ovaries as happening at a young age. It's because we depend on the healthy premenopausal years to provide us with the means so that we don't age more rapidly in our elder years. I mean, I'm almost 82 and I've never taken estrogen in my life. So the idea that we have to take hormones in order to be healthy, progesterone or estrogen or both, is just not correct.
Thank you, Jerilynn. Marcia, did you want to add anything to that? Or I am paying attention to time, and I would like to ask you a couple questions, or at least one from the chat box. It was so interesting, I lost track of time.
I think Dr. Pryor has done
Okay.
a good job answering. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to ask one from the chat box for you. Patricia asks, we know that synthetic birth control does not stop, delay, or suppress the menopausal transition, even though it turns off ovulation. What other factors are contributing to ovarian aging?
Okay, so yeah, even though with those hormones and they're not ovulating, but the process, the folliculogenesis is still happening and everything. So we still have those processes happening in the ovary. So those cycles are still going, so we are still aging. Other factors contributing to ovarian aging, unfortunately, we don't know. We have now this hypothesis that is multiple ovulation is carrying inflammation happening in there, but we don't have enough research on that. As I told you, people started investing money or investigating what is happening molecularly. A lot was done, what is happening with the hormones, with your health, mental health, and those things. But like, what was the molecular cause? We don't know, unfortunately. So it's something we've been discovering now, and luckily, we people are getting more and more attention to that. And I hope in a few more years we will be able to, I will be able to answer that question, but for now we don't know.
I think that's a wonderful answer and also a wonderful way to thank the both of you and conclude. I think the opportunity for clinical research and lab-based research here for female health is enormous. The generation of next generation, rather, of researchers that might be listening, or clinicians, the field is wide open and there's so many questions to be answered. And I encourage people to explore it, both personally as well as professionally. I'm going to thank the both of you for presenting today, and thank our audience for listening. I apologize we didn't get to all of the questions, but we encourage you to attend other Embrace Aging events. And please take a look at our Okanagan Embrace Aging calendar. The month is not over yet, and it's full of additional opportunities for learning ahead. And we look forward to receiving your feedback about today's event and for future events. So thank you very much, and watch for our survey. It's been wonderful hosting you both today. Have a great afternoon,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.